The Korath Imperium measured its age in eclipses, not years. 14,000 eclipses of its home star. 14,000 cycles of conquest, tribute, and silence enforced across 180 subjugated worlds. Its war fleets did not have names. They had numbers, because names implied a fleet might someday be remembered for losing. The Second Reckoning Fleet, 1,800 warships strong, hung in high orbit above a research outpost at the edge of Korath space, awaiting orders from a High Marshal who had never once, in 40 years of service, needed to consider the possibility of failure. His name was Vash Erkine, and he had built his reputation on a single, unbroken principle passed down through 6 generations of his bloodline. Mercy is a resource. Spend it, and you have less power tomorrow than you had today. Vash stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Iron Verdict, studying a report that had just arrived from a scout vessel returning from deep space. The scout had drifted near the edge of an unmapped system, recorded 3 days of passive scans, and fled the moment its sensors detected something it could not immediately classify. Designation, Vash said. His intelligence officer answered. Local star name unconfirmed. Third planet, inhabited species, humanoid. Self-designation, human. Vash studied the readings. A species with radio communication, primitive orbital infrastructure, and something the scout's sensors had flagged with an anomaly marker rarely used in Korath records. What is the anomaly? War Master, the scout detected a transmission, not military, not tactical. It was addressed directly to us. Vash frowned. We have never made contact with this species. They appear to already know that we exist, the officer said, and the transmission was not a plea nor a challenge. He played it. A calm human voice filled the bridge, translated instantly by the ship's linguistic array. 4 words that would follow the Korath Imperium into every history it would ever write about this war. We offer you peace. Vash was silent for a long moment. Then he did something his officers had never once seen him do in 40 years of command. He laughed. War Master, said his second, Counselor Threna Vask, stepping closer to the display, the message contains no demands, no cultural markers of submission, no request for terms. It is simply an offer. Then it is an offer from a species that does not yet understand what it means to face us, Vash said. Every species we have encountered eventually learns the shape of that understanding. Some learn it quickly, some learn it slowly, all of them learn it. Around them, the Iron Verdict hummed with the deep, mechanical certainty of a warship that had never once been forced to doubt its own supremacy. Its corridors stretched for kilometers, lined with soldiers trained from childhood for a single purpose, to make certain that once a world knelt, it never rose again. The Korath Imperium did not conquer through diplomacy. It conquered through the reckoning, a ritual of overwhelming force delivered swiftly enough that resistance never had time to organize into anything beyond a single, doomed instinct. Vash had personally overseen this ritual across 40 campaigns, and in 40 campaigns, he had never once encountered a species that offered terms before the first shot was fired. Bring up the historical index, he ordered. Show me any precedent for an unconquered species initiating contact on terms of apparent equality. The display flickered. No result returned. There is no precedent, his intelligence officer confirmed. In 14,000 eclipses of recorded history, no species has ever contacted the Imperium first, let alone offered peace before conquest began. Vash studied the empty result for a long moment. And for the briefest instant, something flickered behind his composed expression that might, in a lesser officer, have been mistaken for uncertainty. He dismissed it just as quickly. Then we will simply be the ones who set that precedent, he said. Send the Second Reckoning Fleet. Let this species learn, as all others eventually have, that an offer of peace means nothing to an empire that has never once needed to accept one. The message had not come from a desperate species pleading for its survival. It had come from a species that did not yet know it was supposed to be afraid. Vash summoned his council aboard the Iron Verdict, 7 officers who had conquered 40 worlds between them, and played the human transmission again for the full chamber. "They offer terms before we have even arrived in force," said Councillor Threnna Vask, second in command of the fleet. "No demands, no conditions, only an offer of peaceful coexistence and an open channel for further contact." "It is a trick," said another officer. "A stalling tactic. They know what is coming and hope to delay it." Vash raised a hand, and the chamber fell silent. "It does not matter what it is," he said. "No species we have ever encountered has offered peace before being conquered. Peace is not offered. Peace is granted after submission at our discretion." He turned to the star chart, the small blue-green world glowing faint at its center. "They believe themselves equals," Vash said. "That belief is the single most dangerous thing about them, and the single most useful thing about them. We will correct it." He composed the Imperium's response personally, a message he intended to be remembered as the final communication this species would ever receive before its conquest began. "The Korath Imperium does not negotiate with species it has not yet measured. Your offer is refused. Prepare to be catalogued." 200 light-years away, in a fortified command bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, Director Samuel Ockafer received the Imperium's reply and read it twice before setting it down. "They refused," said his second, a sharp-eyed strategist named Dr. Naomi Alori. "I know," Ockafer said. "You expected this." "I hoped otherwise," Ockafer said, "but I expected this." He had overseen Earth's deep space diplomatic program for 11 years, the quieter, less discussed counterpart to the decades-old defense initiative that had, until recently, remained the planet's most closely guarded secret. The offer of peace had not been sent out of naivety. It had been sent because Earth's leadership understood something the Korath Imperium did not yet know about itself. "Log the refusal," Ockafer said. "Officially for the historical record, we offered peace. It was refused on record in their own words." "Why does that matter?" Alori asked. Ockafer looked at her, and for the first time in the conversation, something colder settled into his expression. "Because in a few weeks, when this is over, I want no ambiguity about who chose war and who chose otherwise." Alori studied the refusal message a third time, lingering on its final line. "Prepare to be catalogued." "They didn't even ask what we wanted," she said. "No demands, no conditions. They simply refused the concept of negotiation entirely." "That tells us something valuable," Ockafer said. "It tells us this is not an empire that responds to reason. It's an empire that responds to consequence. We built our entire defense doctrine around exactly that assumption." He turned to the room, addressing not just Ilori, but the network of analysts, engineers, and officers who had spent years preparing for a moment few of them had believed would ever actually arrive. "Activate full readiness across the Ascension Directive," he said. "All 3 shipyards, full production. I want the fleet at maximum strength before that armada crosses the outer marker." "Sir," a junior officer said carefully, "once we commit to full production, there's no scaling back. If our estimate of their fleet size is wrong, then we will have built more than we needed," Ockafer said. "That is a mistake I am willing to make. The reverse mistake is not survivable." He looked once more at the refusal message glowing on the screen, the arrogant, absolute certainty behind every word of it, and allowed himself a single, quiet thought he did not share aloud with the room. They have no idea what they just refused. To understand why the Korath Imperium refused an offer of peace without a moment's genuine consideration, one must first understand what 6,000 years of unbroken conquest does to an empire's capacity for doubt. The Imperium had encountered 180 distinct spacefaring civilizations across its recorded history. Every one of them had followed the same trajectory: first contact, fear, brief resistance, and eventual submission through one of three sanctioned outcomes: tribute, assimilation, or erasure. Not one had ever offered peace before the fighting began. Not one, in 6,000 years, had ever needed to be refused, because not one had ever believed itself in a position to make the offer at all. This was not simply arrogance. It was structural. Korath military doctrine, unchanged in its fundamentals for nearly 3,000 years, contained no formal protocol for evaluating a pre-conquest peace offer, because the concept had never once arisen in any officer's training, any council's deliberation, any historical record available to the current generation of command. High Marshal Vash Erskine was, by Korath standards, an exceptionally capable officer, risen through 40 years of consistent, methodical victory. But his competence had never once been tested against genuine uncertainty. Every campaign he had ever led followed a pattern established millennia before his birth, refined by predecessors who had also never faced meaningful resistance. This made him, without either side fully understanding it, precisely the kind of opponent Earth strategists had spent years preparing for. Colonel Desmuck's unbroken doctrine problem had predicted almost exactly this outcome: an empire so thoroughly insulated from failure that its response to an unprecedented situation would default, reflexively, to the only response it had ever known. In an early planning memo, later declassified alongside the rest of the Ascension Directive's records, Desmuck had written a line that would come to define the entire strategic framework surrounding both the diplomatic initiative and the military preparation behind it. We cannot outconquer an empire 6,000 years old. We can only outthink a doctrine that has never once needed a second option. That single insight, more than any weapon or warship built beneath the ice or ocean floor, was the true foundation of humanity's defense. The Second Reckoning Fleet arrived at the edge of Sol 11 days later, 1,800 warships spreading across the outer system, in a formation the Korath called the Iron Lattice, a doctrine unbroken across 6,000 years of conquest. High Marshal Vash expected the same pattern he had seen in 40 prior campaigns: a show of force, a scramble of primitive defenses, a brief, one-sided engagement, followed by unconditional surrender within 72 hours. Deploy the vanguard, he ordered. 150 ships, establish orbital presence. If they resist, make the resistance brief. The vanguard broke formation and surged toward Earth, engines burning white gold against the dark, expecting the same silence that had preceded every conquest before it. What they found instead was a wall. 700 human warships decloaked in a coordinated instant, arranged along a defensive perimeter that had been rehearsed for years and never once shown to an outside observer. Behind them, hidden in the asteroid debris of the outer belt, automated defense platforms activated in silence, their targeting arrays already locked onto the approaching vanguard before the Korath had finished registering their presence. "Impossible," Vash's tactical officer said. "Sensors show no warp signature. They did not arrive. They were already here." Human ships opened fire. The weapons that struck the Korath vanguard were not crude. They were phase disruptor cannons, engineered over years of study to punch through Korath ablative shielding before the ship's automated repair drones could compensate. 2 Korath cruisers lost primary power in the first volley. A third broke apart entirely, its hull splitting in a way that should not have been possible against armor considered nearly indestructible for 6,000 years. Aboard the Iron Verdict, Vash watched his tactical display recalculate. The number of viable vanguard ships falling with a speed his own doctrine had no framework to explain. "Second wave," he ordered, voice sharpened by the first true edge of alarm he had felt in decades. "Full commitment. Burn them out of the sky." But even as the order left his mouth, a new number scrolled across the display, and for the first time in 40 years of command, High Marshal Vash Erskine felt something close to doubt. Human ship count rising. Not from reinforcements arriving through warp. From hidden shipyards, unseen and unaccounted for, releasing new vessels into the fight faster than the Korath could remove them from it. Aboard the human cruiser Steadfast Answer, Captain Alina Marsh watched the opening exchange unfold with the tight, practiced calm of an officer who had spent 9 years training for exactly this moment. "Formation broken circle, hold position," she ordered. "Let them commit fully before we press the advantage." Her weapons officer tracked the first Korath cruiser's destruction with visible disbelief despite years of simulation. Confirmed kill. Their shielding failed almost instantly against our disruptor frequency. "They've never had to defend against a weapon built specifically to unmake their armor," Marsh said. "That ends today." The Korath vanguard, still committed to its doctrine of overwhelming advance, pressed forward despite mounting losses. 6,000 years of unbroken success, leaving no room in its training for the concept of tactical withdrawal against an inferior species. A cruiser 3 positions from the Steadfast Answer took a direct hit along its engine housing and began venting atmosphere in a long, silent bloom. "They're targeting the Havorson," the sensor officer called out. "She's lost maneuvering thrust." Marsh made the decision instantly. Redirect forward batteries, cover her retreat. The Steadfast Answer banked hard, absorbing 2 strikes meant for the crippled cruiser, buying precious seconds for an emergency engineering crew to restore partial power, and limped the Havorson back behind the human line. It was the closest the opening engagement came to a genuine loss, a reminder that 4 decades of preparation, however thorough, still had to survive the unpredictable chaos of real combat. Behind the human line, hidden shipyards entered full production, releasing new vessels into the fight faster than the Korath could remove them from it. 11 years earlier, Director Samuel Okafor had stood before the same joint council that had, decades before him, first funded the planet's hidden defense program, and asked for something none of his predecessors had ever requested. "Approve a second initiative," he said. "Not weapons, not shipyards. A diplomatic protocol ready to deploy the moment first contact occurs, offering peace before a single shot is fired." A general in the room, skeptical by nature and hardened by decades of classified briefings about the defense program's true scale, asked the obvious question. "Why would we offer peace to a species we've spent 40 years preparing to fight?" Okafor answered without hesitation, because he had spent years preparing the answer. "Because it costs us nothing to offer, and it costs them everything to refuse." He explained his reasoning to a room that took considerable convincing. Every spacefaring empire encountered by any prior civilization, according to the fragmentary signal intelligence gathered over decades of listening, followed one of 2 patterns upon first contact: negotiation between apparent equals or conquest of an apparent inferior. "If they accept peace," Okafor said, "we have avoided a war neither side can be certain of winning outright and gain decades to prepare further openly without the burden of secrecy. And if they refuse, then we have something far more valuable than peace," Okafor said. "We have proof, a recorded, undeniable refusal made freely by their own leadership that will follow them into every future conflict, every future negotiation, every future attempt to claim moral superiority over the species they chose to attack unprovoked." The room that day had held 9 council members, 4 of them veterans of the Ascension Directive's earliest, most secretive years, all of them skeptical of a young director proposing to complicate a defense strategy already decades in the making. "You want us to hand a potential enemy an opportunity to stall," said one council member, a retired admiral who had spent 30 years inside the classified defense apparatus. "To study our positions while pretending to consider peace. This is not caution, Director. This is a vulnerability." "With respect," Akafor replied, "I am not proposing we lower our guard. I am proposing we make our guard mean something. A fleet that only ever threatens is indistinguishable, morally, from an empire like the one it is meant to deter. A fleet that offers peace first and only fights when that peace is refused is something else entirely." "Sentiment," the admiral said, "will not stop an invasion fleet." "No," Akafor agreed, "but it will determine what kind of species survives the invasion, assuming we do. I am not asking you to trust an unknown enemy. I am asking you to let humanity choose, deliberately, what kind of civilization it wants to be remembered as, in the moment before that choice is taken from us by force." The debate stretched across 3 additional sessions before a narrow vote finally approved the initiative. 4 members still opposed, unconvinced that any diplomatic gesture could meaningfully alter the outcome of a conflict most of them privately believed was inevitable regardless. Akafor left that final session with authorization, but without consensus, understanding even then that the true test of his proposal would not come in any committee room, but in the moment, years or decades away, when an actual alien fleet finally received the offer and had to decide for itself what kind of empire it wanted to be remembered as. For 11 years, the offer of peace sat ready, encoded and waiting, attached to every deep space listening protocol Earth maintained. When the Korath scout ship drifted through the outer system 11 days before the second Reckoning Fleet's arrival, Earth sensors detected it within hours. The offer was transmitted before the scout had even completed its own scan. It was refused within 72 hours, exactly as Akafor had privately predicted it would be, based on decades of signal analysis suggesting the Korath Imperium had never once, in 6,000 years, encountered a resistance that did not eventually collapse. 40 years before Akafor's proposal, in the same underground facility, the foundation for humanity's true defense had already been laid by a program that would come to be known, decades later, as the Ascension Directive. Unlike the diplomatic initiative, the Ascension Directive was built entirely on the assumption that peace would fail. 3 shipyards, constructed across 4 decades beneath ocean trenches, polar ice, and hollowed asteroids, produced not just warships, but an entire military doctrine built specifically around defeating an enemy whose exact identity would not be known until the moment of first contact. The directive's founding architect, a strategist, named Colonel Priya Desmuk, had written a single guiding principle into the program's earliest charter, one that Akafor would later cite as the philosophical bridge between the 2 initiatives that ultimately worked in concert. "We do not prepare for war because we want it. We prepare for war so that peace, when offered, is a genuine choice rather than a surrender in disguise." By the time the second Reckoning Fleet arrived at Saul, that preparation had matured into a fleet numbering in the thousands, hidden behind cloaking fields and dormant shipyards, waiting only for the signal that peace had, as predicted, been refused. Colonel Desmuk had not lived to see her doctrine tested. She died 14 years into the program, in the same underground facility where she had first drafted its founding charter, having spent nearly a decade and a half building not weapons alone, but an entire predictive framework for how an unknown alien empire might think, react, and ultimately overreach. Her final research focused almost entirely on a single question that had occupied the last 3 years of her working life: what psychological patterns emerge in any civilization that has never once been forced to lose? She called it the unbroken doctrine problem, and her conclusions, later declassified alongside the rest of the Ascension Directive's founding documents, would prove almost eerily precise. "A species that has never lost does not develop contingency," she wrote. "It develops certainty. And certainty, when finally confronted with genuine resistance, does not adapt gracefully. It breaks." Her successors spent the following decades refining warship doctrine, specifically around exploiting that fracture point, building not merely stronger ships, but an entire military philosophy designed to turn an enemy's greatest strength, its absolute confidence, into its most exploitable weakness. The 3 shipyards built under her original charter, hidden beneath ocean trenches, polar ice, and hollowed asteroid rock, had each been designed with a singular production philosophy: modular fabrication over organic growth, allowing warships to be assembled from pre-manufactured components in hours rather than the years required by most spacefaring civilizations to grow or construct comparable vessels. By the time the Second Reckoning Fleet crossed into Sol's outer system, those 3 shipyards held nearly a decade's worth of stockpiled components, ready to be assembled the moment the diplomatic initiative's inevitable refusal confirmed that war, rather than peace, would define the coming years. Phase 4 complete. Every weapon humanity brought against the Korath Imperium was built around a single design philosophy, refined across decades of study into the physical properties of Korath warship armor. Korath ablative shielding did not resist damage through brute durability alone. It relied on a layered lattice of self-sacrificing plating, designed to burn away in controlled fragments under sustained fire, protecting the hull beneath at the cost of steadily diminishing coverage. It was an effective defense against nearly any weapon a conquered species had ever managed to build in 6,000 years of Imperium history, because no prior opponent had ever hit hard enough, precisely enough, to outpace the lattice's ability to shed damage faster than it accumulated. Human phase disruptor cannons did not attempt to overwhelm that lattice through raw force. They targeted the resonance frequency binding each plating layer to the one beneath it, a frequency the Korath had never needed to vary across millennia because it had never once been meaningfully challenged. A single well-placed strike did not simply damage a Korath cruiser's armor. It caused the entire lattice to shed at once, stripping away the ship's primary defense in a single catastrophic cascade rather than the slow, controlled degradation the armor was designed to manage. It was, as one lead weapons engineer described it in a report later declassified alongside the rest of the Ascension Directive's records, the difference between wearing down a fortress wall and simply removing the keystone. The shipyards behind that weaponry represented an equally significant departure from Korath military production. Imperium warships were assembled through generations-long construction programs, each vessel a singular, deliberate undertaking requiring decades of dedicated resource allocation. Human shipyards instead relied on modular fabrication, producing standardized hull sections, weapon systems, and drive cores in parallel, assembled on demand from components stockpiled years in advance. It meant a human warship could go from raw components to combat-ready status in a matter of hours, provided the components had already been manufactured and stored, a provision the Ascension Directive had spent nearly 4 decades quietly fulfilling. For the first 8 hours of the battle, the Korath believed they were fighting a defensive line that would eventually collapse under sustained pressure. They were wrong. High Marshal Vash committed wave after wave of the Second Reckoning Fleet into the engagement, certain that Korath numbers alone would eventually overwhelm a defense that, by every historical precedent in Imperium records, should have broken hours earlier. Instead, human forces did something the Korath doctrine had no answer for. They stopped merely defending. From behind a debris field disguised for years as ordinary asteroid drift, a second human fleet decloaked, 600 warships fresh from a shipyard buried deep within the belt, none of them older than a few hours of active service. From beneath the ice of a moon, the Korath scouts had dismissed entirely as uninhabited. A third human fleet launched. 400 heavy cruisers the Imperium's threat catalog had never recorded, because it had never been permitted to exist outside a classified hangar. "Redistribute the iron lattice," Vash ordered, his voice losing the calm certainty that had defined 4 decades of command. "Cover both flanks." "Warmaster, we cannot cover 3 approach vectors with a formation built for 1, his tactical officer replied. "They are already inside optimal range on 2 fronts." Aboard the Steadfast Answer, Captain Marsh watched the tactical display shift from defense to offense with a grim, focused intensity that had replaced the tight calm of the battle's opening hours. "All batteries converge on their flank," she ordered. "Osai, redirect power from shields to weapons. We push now while their formation is still adjusting." "Shields at 60% if we do that," her executive officer warned. "Then we make 60% enough," Marsh said. "They've never had to fight an enemy willing to trade defense for offense at the decisive moment. That is exactly the moment we are in." The Steadfast Answer surged forward alongside a dozen sister ships, their combined fire concentrated on a single overextended Korath cruiser that had pushed too far ahead of its formation, its shields buckling under sustained, precisely targeted assault until its hull finally gave way entirely. On the tactical display, the elegant, unbroken lattice of the Second Reckoning Fleet began to fracture, human phase disruptor batteries tearing through ships that had never needed genuine armor before, because nothing had ever hit them with this precision, at this scale, this quickly. A voice broke across every open Korath channel at once, calm, human, and without a trace of fear. "You were offered peace. You chose to be cataloged instead. We are simply honoring your request." Vash stared at the screen as, one by one, the outer edges of his fleet went dark. 400 warships lost within 20 minutes, a number the Korath Imperium had not suffered in a single engagement across its entire recorded history. He gave the order every High Marshal before him had been trained never to give. "All ships," Vash said, his voice hollow with the particular shock of a man discovering in real time that everything he had built his identity on was built on a foundation that had simply never been tested. "Withdraw. Full retreat." The Second Reckoning Fleet, 1,800 strong at the start of the engagement, folded into warp with barely half its number intact. Behind them, Earth's fleet did not pursue. It held its formation, patient and silent, and let the retreat carry a single, undeniable truth back to the heart of the Korath Imperium. Humanity had not offered peace out of weakness. It had offered peace because it had already calculated, with cold and total accuracy, exactly what would happen if that peace was refused. The Korath High Council convened in the Chamber of Eclipses, a hall lit by a suspended model of every star system the Imperium had ever conquered, 14,000 small points of light, each one a testament to 6,000 years of unbroken dominance. High Marshal Vash stood before them, stripped of his ceremonial rank insignia, and delivered a report no High Marshal in Korath history had ever been forced to give. "We lost close to 1,000 ships," he said, "to a species we refused to even negotiate with 11 days before the engagement began." A senior counselor, ancient even by Korath standards, leaned forward with visible disbelief. "They offered terms. You are certain this is documented?" "It is documented," Vash said, "by them and now by us as well. They recorded every stage of the exchange, our refusal, our threat, their response, all of it transmitted openly across every channel available to them the moment the battle turned in their favor." The chamber fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. "Why would they broadcast their own diplomatic overture to the wider galaxy?" another counselor asked. What do they gain from proving they offered peace? Vash had asked himself the same question during the long, humiliating Edirne journey, and had arrived reluctantly at an answer he suspected was correct. Because it costs them nothing to be seen as reasonable, he said, and it costs us everything to be seen as the empire that refused reason and lost anyway. A younger counselor, one who had never personally overseen a conquest, spoke up with the particular boldness of someone who had not yet learned the price of challenging established doctrine. This is a single engagement, one fleet. The Imperium has faced setbacks before and recovered within a single generation. This was not a setback, Vash said. A setback is a battle lost due to poor terrain or bad information or an enemy who simply fought harder on a given day. This was a species that spent decades preparing specifically for the moment we would refuse their offer and built an entire war doctrine around the assumption that we would. He gestured, and the tactical logs updated to display the full scope of the engagement. 400 Korath vessels lost to weapons calibrated with impossible precision against Imperium shielding, hidden fleets numbering in the thousands. A diplomatic offer transmitted before the Korath had even finished their initial reconnaissance. They knew what we were before we ever arrived, Vash said. They knew what we would say, because every species we have ever encountered has said the same thing when offered a choice between negotiation and conquest. They built their entire strategy around our own unbroken history. The eldest counselor in the chamber, who had personally overseen the final conquest of the Threll assembly 4,000 years earlier, spoke last, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone forced to reconsider a lifetime of certainty in a single afternoon. 6,000 years, she said quietly. 180 worlds conquered, and in 6,000 years, not one of them thought to offer us peace before the war began, let alone build the strength to make that offer meaningful. She looked at Vash, and for the first time in the proceedings, her expression carried something closer to unease than judgment. "What do they call themselves?" she asked. "This species that offers peace as though it were a weapon." "Human," Vash said. "They call themselves human." Word of the refusal, and the defeat that followed it, spread through Korath-controlled space faster than any official channel could contain it. On worlds conquered centuries earlier, where entire generations had been raised to believe resistance was mathematically impossible, the story of a species that had offered peace, been refused, and one anyway began to circulate in careful, hushed conversations the Imperium's own information control had never been designed to suppress. In the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, Director HFY watched the final battle report scroll across the main display. The Second Reckoning Fleet's retreat confirmed. Earth's own losses remarkably light by comparison. "Casualties?" he asked. "Under 2,000 personnel across the fleet," an officer reported. 31 ships lost. Enemy losses exceed 900 vessels. HFY nodded slowly, thinking not of the numbers, but of the 11 years he had spent building a program some of his colleagues had quietly dismissed as sentimental, unnecessary, even naive. Dr. Ilori approached, studying the same numbers with an expression that mixed relief with something more complicated. "They're going to say we baited them," she said. "That the offer of peace was never genuine, only a pretext to justify the war that followed." "Let them say it," HFY replied. "The offer was genuine. If they had accepted it, we would have honored it completely, and this war would never have happened. The fact that our preparation for their refusal was thorough does not make the offer any less real." "Will anyone believe that?" HFY considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Some will, some won't, but the record exists, unaltered, for anyone who wishes to examine it honestly. We offered peace before a single shot was fired. That fact does not change, no matter how the story gets told afterward." In the weeks that followed, as the truth of both the Ascension Directive and the diplomatic initiative became public knowledge, humanity's global response was neither wholly celebratory nor wholly comfortable. Nations debated the ethics of a peace offer calculated as much for its strategic value as its sincerity. Historians argued over whether an offer prepared for refusal could ever be called a genuine offer at all. HFY answered these questions publicly, patiently, understanding that a species capable of building this kind of preparation in secret was also capable of demanding honest scrutiny once the secrecy was no longer necessary. "We did not want war," he told one particularly pointed hearing before the newly formed Saul Diplomatic Council. "But we understood, des before contact, that wanting peace and being prepared for its absence were not contradictory positions. They were, in fact, the only way to make an offer of peace mean anything at all." 6 months later, deep-range sensors detected renewed activity along the Korath border. A new fleet under construction, larger and more cautious than the one that had come before, commanded not by Vash, whose failure had cost him his rank, but by a younger officer instructed, for the first time in Korath history, to study the enemy's doctrine before engaging it. Aboard a newly commissioned flagship, the Samuel HFY, Rear Admiral Naomi Ilori, promoted in the aftermath of the battle to command the growing Saul Defense Fleet, reviewed the latest intelligence with the same careful patience that had defined her mentor's decades of work. "They're not refusing to talk this time," she observed. "Preliminary signals suggest they may actually respond to renewed contact." "Then extend the offer again," HFY said, now serving as senior advisor to a council that had, for the first time in the program's history, invited him to speak openly rather than in classified briefing rooms. "Exactly as it was before. No conditions, no threats. And if they refuse again?" HFY allowed himself a small, tired smile, the same expression he had worn 11 years earlier, standing before a skeptical council and proposing something no one else in the room had believed would matter. "Then we will be ready again," he said, "because that is the choice we built. Peace, offered honestly, backed by a strength that ensures the offer is never mistaken for weakness." Somewhere beyond the edge of charted space, the Korath Imperium prepared its answer, uncertain for the first time in 6,000 years whether conquest remained the only path forward, or whether the small blue world at the edge of their maps had finally taught them the cost of assuming it always would be. Director HFY keyed a final entry into the Ascension Directive's public record, a record that, for the first time in the program's 40-year history, the entire world was finally permitted to read. Phase 7 complete. We offered peace once. It was refused. We will offer it again, not because we have forgotten what refusal costs, but because we have never stopped believing the offer was worth making. Let them decide, this time more carefully. Humanity had built an empire's worth of strength, and had chosen first to offer peace instead. The next choice belonged to someone else,